Today we're going to start our second half of our central nervous system, which is split into two major things that we're going to talk about. First is the central nervous system, and then we're going to go in and hit on the peripheral nervous system. Both of these sections are very big, so make sure that you're studying along the way, and if you don't understand something, please make sure that you come talk to me. So today we're going to start with the central nervous system, abbreviated CNS. The CNS consists of two major organs, your brain and then your spinal cord. This occupies your dorsal body cavity. If you remember in chapter 1, we learned about the dorsal and ventral body cavity. So again, dorsal is going to be your brain and spinal cord. The whole point of the brain and spinal cord is to act as the integrating command center, and it interprets any sensory information coming in, and then it processes that information and decides what it wants to do. After it decides what it wants to do, it issues those instructions to whichever muscle or gland that needs to do the action. Here is the central nervous system as it looks like in a 13-week-old. And then here when we become an adult brain. Notice that there is a lot of growth that is done, and there are 4 major regions, and we're going to talk about each one of these. They are cerebral hemisphere, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. To give a little bit of a description of the brain, it is actually only a little over 3 pounds, and it's described as 2 fistfuls of pinkish gray tissue. It's wrinkled, and so they say it looks like a walnut, and for some reason, the book wants you to know it has a texture of cold oatmeal. Now, this is the largest and most complex mass of nervous tissue in your entire body. The brain gets the credit for so many different things, and like we said, it's in charge of almost every single decision that you make in your body. Again, the 4 regions are cerebral hemisphere, diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. Today, we're going to focus specifically on the cerebral hemisphere, and then in the next lesson, we'll learn about the other 3. So just as a introduction, your cerebral hemisphere is the part most people recognize as the brain. Up here, you can see the big, huge part of this really light pink here is your entire cerebral hemisphere. It's huge. This is an image that is pulled from your book to kind of give you a brief overview of the cerebral hemisphere, and we're going to talk about each one of these as well. So your cerebral hemisphere is also known as your cerebrum for short. They are paired, which means there's a right and left side, and they make up the superior part of your brain, which means they're going to be the top part of your brain. It includes more than over half of the brain's mass. So if the brain is approximately 3 pounds, it's about 1.5 of that. The surface is made up of something called gyri or gyri, ridges, and grooves called sulci. There are also fissures, which are also called deeper grooves, and there are a lot of important fissures that help separate the different regions of the brain that we learn about. There's one specifically that I do expect you to know, and that's called the longitudinal fissure. It separates the left half of the brain from the right half of the brain. We'll also be talking about lobes of the brain as well, and these are often named based on what cranial bone that is underneath them. So remember, we have our frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, and temporal bone. And those are our 4 lobes that we'll learn about. So just to give you a little preface on some of the words that we've used so far, when I say that we have ridges called gyri or gyrus, that's going to be the top of this region right here. So right here, this region's all gyrus. Then that little groove right here is the sulcus or sulci. And then if you have a pretty deep groove right here, that's your fissure. Here is what an actual brain looks like if you want to see the little walnut and the kind of texture look it has. This picture also illustrates the different lobes. Note frontal lobe, temporal, parietal still on top of the head, and occipital's back here. Now, with the cerebral hemisphere, there are 3 main regions that we're going to talk about. First is the cortex. This is superficial gray matter. Then we have a little bit deeper, the white matter. And then the last one are called basal nuclei, which are just pockets of gray matter deep down. So let's start with the cerebral cortex. The functions of the cerebral cortex are speech, memory, logical and emotional responses, your consciousness, interpretation of sensations, and a lot of voluntary movements that we have. Now, within the cerebral cortex, there are different functional areas, and that's what we're going to be learning about next. Again, it's a lot, so let me know if you have any questions. So here is an image that I pulled from your book. You are more than welcome to pull this lesson back up and relook at it, but we're going to be referring to a lot of these different areas that we're going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and get started with these different areas. First, we're going to talk about something called the primary somatic sensory area. If I go back to the previous picture, your primary area is going to be right here. Primary somatic sensory area. So it's pointing to this dark blue here. This is located in the parietal lobe, and it's going to be posterior or behind your central sulcus. So your central sulcus is right here. It separates your front from your back brain, and remember it's located posterior to it, so behind it. It receives impulses from the body's sensory receptors, hence why it's called sensory area. So this is going to detect things like pain, temperature, light touch. It does a lot of senses except for your special senses. So what it does not do are things like your eyesight or hearing or tasting. There is also something that is derived called a sensory homunculus, and this is a spatial map of a lot of different sensory areas that this area controls. And the left side of the primary somatic sensory area actually receives impulses from the right side of your body. So they said that this is a crossed pathway. So, for example, if you feel something on your right side, your left side of your brain is processing that. Here is the example of your primary somatic sensory homunculus. Again, homunculus just means little person, and it kind of shows you the part of your brain and where is it picking up signals or sensory information, such as your elbow, your thumb, your nose, are you feeling things on your teeth, etc. Now, there are a few areas that are involved in special senses besides the somatic sensory area. For example, your visual or your eyesight, what you see is controlled in your occipital lobe, located in the back of your head. Your auditory area, which is things that you hear, this is processed in your temporal lobe. And then olfactory area, olfactory is not a term you may know, but it means smell. The olfactory area is going to be located in your temporal lobe as well. The next one we're going to talk about is the primary motor area. Now, this is located anterior or in front of that central sulcus, which makes it be in the frontal lobe. So if I go back to that picture, here is your primary motor area. Notice here's your central sulcus. It's located anterior or in front of it. So just like what it sounds, motor area, it's going to allow us to control our motor movements. This controls skeletal muscles. Just like our sensory, this also has a homunculus spatial map, and these pathways are crossed as well, which means if we're moving the right arm, our left side of our brain is processing and telling us to do that. Again, here is the homunculus map showing which part of our brain controls our fingers, thumb, face, lips, etc. The next two areas that we're going to talk about are the Broca's area and the anterior association area. Broca's area is also known as the motor speech area because this is involved in our actual physical ability to speak. What that means is that we can hear someone speak to us and we can process what they're saying. But when we go to respond, while we do know what we're saying, we are not able to actually vocalize those words and say it properly. Typically, this is common in people who have had a stroke. For example, I have a lady who comes into the store quite often, and she thinks that she's saying her words, but she's just repeating the word shimmy, shimmy, shimmy. Now, the Broca's area is usually in your left hemisphere. It's not located in your right hemisphere. So the Broca's area, if we're looking at the map, Broca's area is located right here, is your motor speech. The other one is your anterior association area. This is called anterior, which means it's in the front, which would help you understand that it's in the frontal lobe. Anterior association area, which is the front of your brain, is involved in a lot of higher intellectual reasoning or socially acceptable behavior, what is acceptable in public. Also helps with language comprehension, understanding language, and complex memories. Now, complex memories are also stored in the temporal lobe as well. Oftentimes, our anterior association area is a lot bigger than other mammals because of this whole higher intellectual reasoning that we have. So if we were looking at the anterior association area, you can see it here. Note that within this area, you see a lot of working memory, problem solving, understanding complex languages, and sign language, and all of that. The last two that we're going to talk about in your cerebral cortex are your posterior association area. Note that this is posterior, so this is going to be located in the back of your brain. This whole point is to recognize patterns and faces that we see. And then the last one is Wernicke's area. This plays an important part in speech comprehension. So while you are allowed to speak, when people are speaking to you, you have a hard time understanding it. It just gets all jumbled. This is found in the superior part of your temporal lobe, and oftentimes this is said to be in your left cerebral hemisphere as well. So if we're looking at the picture over here, our posterior association area is located here in the back. And then the outline part that we see over here is your Wernicke's as well. A couple things before we move on, I do want to point out, here is your temporal lobe over here. You do see your olfactory, which is smell, and auditory, which is going to be hearing. And then over here in your occipital area, we did mention this. This is your visual or your eyesight back here. The other two parts of your cerebral hemisphere is going to be your cerebral white matter. This is composed of fiber tracts that are deep to the gray matter of your cortex, and the whole part of this cerebral white matter is to carry impulses to, from, and within that cortex. There are a lot of important fibers that run throughout this to carry signals. And so this is often called white matter because it's myelinated. It's going to transmit those nerve impulses very quickly. And there are a lot of different fiber tracts that things can be transmitted through. One of the most important ones, and I'm going to expect you to know this for your test, is your corpus callosum. The whole point of this is to connect your left and right hemispheres. So when I say hemispheres, I mean the left and the right. This actually allows both of your halves of your brain to communicate. Your left can communicate with your right and vice versa. The corpus callosum is actually a special type of fiber tract called a commissure. Besides commissures, there are two other types, and they each have their own function. So again, commissures allow both halves to communicate. If you are an association fiber, this just connects areas within a hemisphere. So this allows everything in the left hemisphere to communicate with another thing in the left hemisphere. So they're associating within the same hemisphere. And then the last type is something called a projection fiber. So if you think about the word, what project means, it actually connects your cerebrum to all of the other lower central nervous system centers. So it allows your cerebrum to connect with your diencephalon or your cerebellum or your brainstem. So it allows you to connect further down. To kind of illustrate these different tracks, this picture again is taken from your textbook. You have access to this as well. So a commissure A good example is this is your corpus callosum. Again, it's this green. It allows your left and right to communicate with each other. The other one is your association. This is your red line here. So this allows one side of the brain to connect with that same side. And then the last one are going to be your projection fibers. These are the blue fibers that run here. And these blue fibers go all the way from the top of your cortex all the way through and even down to lower brain structures of the brain. And this is the last thing that we're going to talk about today, which is basal nuclei. Remember, basal nuclei are within that white matter, there are islands of gray matter. And this whole function of basal nuclei is to regulate voluntary control activities. And it does this by modifying instructions that are sent to the skeletal muscles through this primary motor cortex that we talked about. Now, the reason I mention basal nuclei is because oftentimes basal nuclei are damaged or have trouble working normally for individuals that have Huntington's or Parkinson's disease. If you have these two diseases, oftentimes your motor functions are going to be not functioning normally. You can have tremors or have trouble moving, slurred speech, and oftentimes it's because there are problems within these basal nuclei structures of your brain. And that's the end of today's lesson. It was a lot. Please make sure you review your notes. And as always, I hope you guys have a great day.